Imagine waking up in a city where every building has the right to broaden the road in front of the building. What would happen? Within a year, there will be chaos in the city. That's what will happen if you don't keep an eye on the bigger picture view of your organization. You're watching Enterprise Architecture Radio, and this is episode 115. I asked the people what they would like to hear in the upcoming episodes, and the people have spoken. We are going to cover a comparison between various enterprise architecture frameworks, but I won't be able to cover everything in one single episode, so I've split it into multiple episodes. But not to worry, I'm going to publish these episodes within 1 week. At least that's going to be the attempt. We are going to cover foundations, in which I will cover the foundation of all the enterprise architecture frameworks. Then we will take each framework one by one. And then finally, we will do a comparative analysis between them and understand the differences. But before I cover the foundations of each framework, we need to understand why we are talking about frameworks at all. So absolute basics. A framework is a map. If I ask anyone to do enterprise architecture today, what would they do? Where would they start? If you wanted to understand what an organization is, it'll be very difficult for you to map it without a framework because you wouldn't know where to start. Should we start with the business? Or should we start with the processes? Or should we start with the technologies? Or should we start with the people? Or should we start with, where do we begin? And where do we go from there? What's more important? What's less important? And so on. So what a framework does is it gives you a template, a path, a way in which you can understand what the organization is. So it's basically a checklist of all the information that you need to gather about the framework. Once you go through the checklist, you will have all the information gathered. You may also have some connections between the various pieces of information, which essentially connects all the dots and gives you a picture of the organization. So that is a framework. Now, we are going to cover 4 different frameworks, and I'll give you a very quick overview of each framework today. So let's start with the first framework, which is the TOGAF framework. Now, TOGAF is the acronym for the Open Group Architecture Framework. The Open Group is an organization that has published this framework, and it has its roots in other frameworks such as DoDAF and other practices such as Agile and so on. The unique thing about the TOGAF framework is it has a content framework. A content framework is essentially a checklist of all the things that I talked about earlier. But it also has a method. It is called the architecture development method. That's what's unique about the TOGAF framework, because it doesn't just tell you what information to gather, but it also tells you in a step-by-step manner how to gather, where should you start. Even things such as how to set up an enterprise architecture capability, which is called the capability framework. It tells you that you need an architecture board. It tells you that you need a framework. You need a content framework, which should be customized according to your organization's specific needs. It also tells you that you need a governance model, which will ensure that you are following the framework appropriately, you are gathering information correctly, etc., etc. You're maintaining the documentation standards, etc. So TOGAF framework has all of these things. It doesn't just have a content framework. It also has an architecture development method. It also has a capability framework and so on. It also has a lot of reference models and reference architectures and series guides and best practices and such within the ecosystem, not specifically a part of the framework. And since TOGAF 10, they have separated the two. The core framework contains only the content framework and the method and the governance and so on. And then we have the series guides and reference models and reference architectures, which are separate from the framework, but in general, a part of the overall ecosystem. So if you really ask me, TOGAF framework, and I'm starting with that. So TOGAF framework is the most comprehensive framework out there at this point in time, simply because it has an ecosystem, and it's a thriving ecosystem because it keeps on getting updated on a regular basis. As we learn new things, it gets added to the series guides and the reference architecture and the reference models. It gets added to the series guide ecosystem. So it's the most comprehensive. The second architecture framework is a significant architecture framework because it is the Zachman framework. John Zachman is known as the father of enterprise architecture, and he's the one who coined the term enterprise architecture, and he's the one who's created the first enterprise architecture framework, which is called the Zachman framework. So while TOGAF is a comprehensive framework, Zachman is the first framework that came along. Zachman framework was the first time when somebody came up with the idea that we need a bigger picture view of the organization. Somebody who said that let's have a template that will basically collect information about the organization from various perspectives and various angles, and use that information to come up with a strategy for the future. It asks specific questions to the enterprise architecture stakeholders, questions such as what, when, why, how, where, when, etc., right? And then it looks at it from various perspectives such as, the executive perspective, the architect's perspective, the engineer's perspective, and so on. And we'll get into the detail of it when we talk about Zachman framework in a future episode. And the third framework that we are going to talk about is the DoDAF architecture framework. DoDAF stands for Department of Defense Architecture Framework. And obviously, it was created by the Department of Defense in the United States to primarily manage the architecture of governmental organizations. It's primarily used for governmental organizations where the governance is extremely strict, where the failure of a mission could mean life or death, where there are many complex moving parts and everything needs to be governed from the top in a bureaucratic organization. This Department of Defense Architecture Framework is not very popular within the corporate environment because we don't usually have a very bureaucratic, hierarchical environment in the private sector. This is usually more popular within the government sector, where governance, bureaucracy, approvals, all these things are extremely valuable, where all these things are necessary for everything to continue to function efficiently. Now, this is a very high-level overview of TOGAF, Zachman, and DoDAF. We will get into the details of each framework in the future episodes and also the differences. So this is the first episode and it's a short one. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, then please let YouTube know. Like, share, and subscribe and comment. Please let me know how you like this new format of, I'm trying to reduce the time of these episodes to 8 to 10 minutes to keep them very easily consumable. So do let me know what you think about this new format. And watch out for the next episode where we will deep dive into the TOGAF framework a little bit. Once again, Enterprise Architecture Radio is not just a podcast, it is a collaboration platform. So help me make it a collaboration platform. Come together, talk to each other, guide each other, help each other out. But most importantly, have a ton of fun.